Right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Plant Magazine's CleanTech Roundtable. We have a lot of great panelists from across the industry. I'm Mario Sawinski, editor of Plant Magazine, and I will be your moderator. During the roundtable, we will look at the adoption of clean technology in the manufacturing space, focusing on how manufacturers can be sustainable and reduce their carbon footprint. This will include a look at renewable energy, how plants are becoming more carbon neutral, and what companies are doing to help. Plant also dives into the electric vehicle sector and how it is affecting a clean technology space in Canada. We will now have each panelist briefly introduce themselves, and then we will get into discussion, which promises to be a good one. Dennis, why don't you start by introducing yourself?
Hi, good morning. I'm Dennis Dustin. I'm the president of Alps Welding Limited. We are a custom metal fabricator based in Woodbridge, just north of Toronto. We manufacture equipment for a variety of industries, including a lot of energy equipment, mining, power generation, specialty chemicals, really diverse range of industries that we manufacture for. And that equipment goes into operation all over North America and globally as well. We're about 60 employees, and we have been a vendor into the clean technology supply chain for many years and see that as a key area of growth for our business.
Matthew, you want to go next?
Morning, everyone. I'm Matthew Forte. I'm the president of the Accelerate Alliance. The Accelerate Alliance is a newly launched coalition of companies, of course my phone goes off at the same time, of companies who have come together and associations who've come together from across the zero emission vehicle supply chain. So that's everything from mining and refining through to manufacturing, but also software and R&D. You know, the idea is to work together to build a supply chain strategy for Canada that positions, you know, our electric vehicle and zero emission vehicle sector as globally competitive.
Robert, can you go next?
Yeah, sure. My name is Robert Hornung. I'm the president and CEO of the Canadian Renewable Energy Association, and we're the national industry association representing about 320 companies active in the deployment of wind energy, solar energy, and energy storage across Canada. We work at all applications from large utility scale facilities to distributed energy resources that you'll find on small businesses and homes throughout the country.
Daniel, can you go next, please?
Yes, thank you, Mario. I'm Daniel Braton. I'm the president and CEO of Electric Mobility Canada, one of the oldest electric mobility associations in the world. We have members ranging from EV owners group to vehicle manufacturer to infrastructure providers to utilities to research centers, cities, and environmental NGOs. So we are the broad umbrella of everything electric mobility, and that's why we helped found the Accelerate Alliance. So we are very close with Matthew and his team, and we dedicate, you know, want to make sure that we create jobs while fighting climate change and air pollution from BC to Atlantic Canada and create jobs at the same time. So so that's what we do, and it's a very busy time.
And Raj, can you go next?
Hi, I'm Raj Dasgupta. I'm the CEO of Elektrava. We're a lithium-ion battery manufacturer, and we're, of course, well integrated into the clean tech sector by making lithium-ion batteries. Most of our batteries are going into heavy-duty vehicles, whether they be mostly in warehouses with customers like Walmart and Home Depot. But we also have battery systems going into high voltage heavy duty vehicles such as electric buses and trucks, which is a more nascent market for us. And Elektrava is, you know, it's in our company mandate that we're committed to climate change mitigation and all efforts to do so through our technology.
All right, thank you, everyone. On to the discussion at hand. I'll ask one of the panelists a question, at which point they will have the first opportunity to answer. Once they are done, it will be the open discussion for everyone. We will start with Dennis for the first question. Looking at the adoption of clean technology in the manufacturing space, how can manufacturers be more sustainable and reduce their carbon footprint?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, you know, one area, you know, which is, I guess, not really technology related, it's more process related, is just around efficiency and waste. You know, I think a lot of manufacturers in this country are still well down the curve, I guess, on adopting lean manufacturing, a lot of productivity improvements. So, you know, I think especially in the small and mid-sized manufacturing space where I operate, I think there are huge opportunities for companies to improve their efficiency and eliminate waste. You know, we talk about things like scrap and idle time on machines and things like that, where, you know, I think there's huge potential for gains in just reducing the amount of energy that's required, you know, in the manufacturing sector. You know, and all of that doesn't really depend on any new or fancy technology. It's really operations and improving, you know, leaning out operations. So I think that's a big area of opportunity. And then I think the other one that's kind of low-hanging fruit is electrification. You know, there's still a lot of obviously vehicles, you know, cars and trucks, you know, that could be electrified, but then warehouse and operating equipment, right? Forklifts and you know, all that kind of equipment that's operating in warehouses and machines. So I think that's kind of the low-hanging fruit that can be addressed now, should be addressed now, you know, even without the need for a lot of these emergent technologies to, you know, to be available. So that's where we're kind of focused and where I think most small and mid-sized manufacturers should be focused.
Thank you very much. And now we'll just have an open discussion. So if anybody has wants to answer that question, please go ahead.
I might add just a thought to that. I completely agree. Efficiency and electrification are critical. Another element is to ensure that you're using non-emitting electricity at the end of the day. And we see companies all around the world who are making greenhouse gas emission reduction commitments. And often they're looking, one of the first places they look is what can they do to decarbonize their electricity supply? And so you see companies from all different kind of sectors, whether it's your Google or your General Motors or your Johnson & Johnson, making these sorts of commitments and then signing agreements directly to purchase renewable energy to provide their electricity needs. In Canada, that's a bit more challenging because of our electricity market structures. Where that can happen very easily is in Alberta. And in Alberta, just so far in 2021, there have been more than 1,200 megawatts of new wind and solar energy projects committed to that are going to be built out because of corporate procurement, looking for that green power essentially for their operations. That's harder to do in other parts of the country, but utilities are responding. Nova Scotia is creating a green choice program to allow their manufacturers to move to make direct purchases of renewable energy. Saskatchewan is introducing SAS Power is introducing 2 programs next year to do the same sort of thing. So utilities across the country are hearing demands from their customers that they are looking to move towards greater adoption of renewable electricity for both cost-saving purposes and also greenhouse gas emission reduction purposes. And that's going to be an important element in terms of reducing your carbon footprint as well.
Daniel, I think you're on mute there.
I am on mute. I'm sorry. Happens in every Zoom, doesn't it? To us at EMC, it's very important to we work in a collaborative way with groups like you know, Canria, because we think that the best fit for us is to electrify and decarbonize at the same time. When we want to talk about you know, electric mobility being as efficient as possible, we want to come from a clean grid, and that's very important. That's something that we see already in BC and Quebec and elsewhere. But it's very interesting to see some gains being done, you know, some progress happening in Alberta, for instance, and hopefully in Saskatchewan with SAS Power, because it will make one hell of a difference for the carbon footprint of the electric vehicles from light to heavy duty. And when you want to talk about efficiency, well, just going from a gas vehicle to an electric vehicle, I mean, it goes from an efficiency of 30% to an efficiency of 90%. So just switching from that type of vehicle does make a huge difference regarding energy efficiency and lower carbon footprint.
One of the things I think about too is looking more deeply into the supply chain. So, to the extent that manufacturers can procure their more upstream inputs and their raw materials more closely to home, that reduces transportation, that reduces carbon emissions, obviously. And obviously we want to move to an electrified world, but until then, having access to those raw materials, to those upstream elements, and kind of growing that side of the supply chain more closely to home, I think is an important part of this. So think about, minerals and metals that, sometimes are shipped abroad and then refined and then shipped back to Canada. That's a huge footprint. And so if we can, make headway in reducing that, I think it'll be an important step.
Yeah, I tend to agree with the other, all the other speakers. There's nothing I disagree with. On the supply chain front, that's a big component. I think it's too easy to say you're reducing emissions by just moving them offshore. The other advantage we have here in Canada is we actually have a pretty, not all the provinces, but especially British Columbia, Ontario, Quebec, we do have a very clean grid. And the electrification will have a very, very high impact here. And of course, expanding domestic supply chain. There are also a few standards with respect to manufacturing that have come out. I know ISO has 14,000 or 14,001. There's a standard for environmental manufacturing, which encourages recycling and reduction of waste. So there are a number of standards that are similar, I think.
All right, thank you very much. Moving on to our next question. This one will be for Daniel. CleanTech encompasses a broad range of technologies related to recycling, renewable energy, information technology, green transportation, electric motors, etc. Where do you believe Canada is thriving the most, and in which areas do you see potential for Canada to adopt cleaner tech?
That's a good question. First of all, we have a lot of critical minerals that are key to making renewables and electric mobility. So I think that's where we could really strive. But we have to make sure that we don't just end up extracting those minerals and sending them elsewhere. So all the value-added products can be made, whether it's in the US or China, because right now, if you look at lithium, for instance, 99% of lithium being extracted from Canada goes to China directly. So it's a real issue. So I think we have a key opportunity. Actually, we have a historic opportunity to make sure that we develop a zero-emission vehicle supply chain and a renewable supply chain that can make Canada a global leader. We have missed some of these opportunities in the past, whether it's at the renewable level or the electric mobility level. Back in 2009, for instance, when we had the last financial crisis, what we saw was that the Obama administration supported GM and Chrysler and putting them back in business. Let's put it that way. But ensuring that they would do R&D on electric mobility, which is something that was not done in Canada. So we missed an opportunity there. If we miss this opportunity regarding electric mobility, so from motors to batteries to renewables, if we miss this opportunity this time, it's going to be the last call. I mean, everybody's working very hard to make sure that they don't stay as dependent and vulnerable towards the Chinese market as they are right now, the Chinese suppliers. So there's a geopolitical and economic issue here at play, and the timing is now. That's why we talk to the federal government, all of us. I'm sure that Robert has these conversations these days. When we look at the Build Back Better plan in the US, this is something that's preoccupying for our members. So there's a real opportunity because of the fact that we have critical minerals in Canada to develop good technologies. We have qualified workers. We have amazing research being done in the country. We have an automotive sector that's been there for decades and has a lot of experience. So everything's pretty much in a good position. We have to have a plan. We don't have a plan yet. So that's why us at EMC want work collaboratively with Robert and Matthew and others to make sure that we do have a plan to secure quality jobs for Canadians all across the country.
Yeah, Mary, if I can just.
Oh, go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, well, just briefly, I mean, I completely agree with that. And I think that, if the question is, where are we thriving now in Canada? I mean, clearly we've got, clean energy, and that's been discussed, Ontario, Quebec, BC in particular, and we've got the opportunity to develop more of that. Particularly Alberta is doing a lot of great work there. I mean, I think it's probably an underreported story to some extent, right? But what I think needs to happen also is a culture, a policy culture, a government culture that fosters more companies that do the higher value work, right? And so that encourages through various levers of policy companies to be founded here, to take advantage of those critical minerals that Daniel's talking about, and not only be founded, but to grow and to thrive here and to employ Canadians, right? I think that, and there are some great examples. We have them on this call, but we need that times 1,000, and that I think is really where Canada needs to be putting its thoughts towards. We don't have a history of that in Canada, right? We have some really smart companies that have grown up in various sectors. Some of them are still around. A lot of them get sold off. We want to make sure that, to Daniel's point too, that this is an opportunity to actually grow an ecosystem of corporate success in a clean tech environment.
Yeah, I'd echo those comments. I think as Daniel mentioned, you don't get too many opportunities, and if you lose them, if you miss them, you won't get another shot. I mean, this is an emerging industry, but it's emerging very quickly. A couple things I've noticed is Canada excels at research and development in this industry. There's Elektrava, we're a good example. There's Hydrogenics, a bunch of other names we can roll off. But when it comes to fostering the domestic demand, this is where it really, I'll give you an example, is on electric buses. In the US, there's a 75% requirement for domestic content in any federally funded electric bus procurement. Canada has a very substantial electric bus procurement plan, but there's no significant Canadian content requirement. So the batteries for those buses, are really it's easier to use Chinese systems for that rather than Canadian built. While in the US, there's a strong incentive for that domestic content there, so that will get built. And once that gets built, it becomes available for other industries, trucks, but other non-subsidized vehicles, and it gives them a head start. So this is an opportunity that we seem to have missed, and hopefully we don't miss other ones.
I'll just add two quick thoughts. One is that, as everybody has said, now's the time. I mean, Canada's not alone. All countries are looking to capitalize on this economic opportunity. Yeah. And all the players who are involved, or a lot of the finance that's involved, is free to go anywhere. And at the end of the day, Canada has to recognize that it's actually competing for this investment and competing for these opportunities. And if we don't provide an environment that's actually conducive to that investment's going to very happily go somewhere else. And so we need to be very thoughtful about that. The other thing I was going to say is that we're looking at a pretty fundamental transformation in energy systems. And it's not just an issue of new technologies, like whether it's wind and solar or electric vehicles. It's also all of the technology that's going to be needed to facilitate the integration of those technologies going forward. So it's a hardware, it's a software kind of issue. It's a system that we're changing. And Canada on the renewable side has a big advantage. We have 80% of our electricity is already non-emitting, which means we don't have to focus, pay the same amount of investment and attention on decarbonizing the grid as some other countries are, which gives us the potential to be a leader in thinking about how we integrate that decarbonized electricity, how we integrate distributed energy resources like solar panels on a roof or an EV in the driveway with the rest of the electricity system. And there's a tremendous opportunity there because the world is moving in this direction. And we have the opportunity to be a leader if we decide to pursue it.
I also think that there's a couple of other areas where we've traditionally been strong. I think a lot of times when we look at clean tech, we look at what's kind of new and emerging, and how can Canada be a player. And sometimes we don't look at where we've been. So for the last, I would say 30, 40 years, Southern Ontario in particular has been a leader in water treatment technologies. It's water filtration, water conservation. Maybe it's because of our proximity to the Great Lakes, I don't know, but we are a world leader in water technology. And as we move into a world where we're looking at conserving resources generally, I think water is going to be a huge issue, and that's an area where we can be a global player, and we can be a real leader because of our traditional investment in those areas. I think nuclear is another one where we've been strong globally. And I think nuclear has got to be part of the solution going forward. I think we're going to get into some issues about where electricity is going to come from. But Canada, particularly here in Ontario, huge strength in the nuclear industry. And then the other one that I see as a big opportunity is biomass. We've got a lot of it. There's certain parts of the country, particularly in Quebec, they've done some great work around biomass. But if you look at Scandinavian countries, they're using that resource. Some of these are controversial, and there's lots of work to be done. But I think we should also look at where our strengths are from a resource point of view and from an existing investment point of view. We've got a lot of a huge foundation to build from.
And I think we should talk about green hydrogen for industry as well, which can be produced through renewable energy, which could make one hell of a difference for ships and plants. And so that, to me, is a key area where Canada has a lot of experience. In transportation, it's more battery electric, but for industry and then ships and planes, I think there's a business case there for hydrogen. And the government of Canada, has published last year, almost a year to the day, its hydrogen strategy for Canada. Now we are working and trying to convince the federal government to come up with electric mobility strategy for Canada, including a ZEV supply chain, and working in collaboration with Canada, because we think that there's a great opportunity there. And let's be frank here. When we look at the data regarding climate change, I mean, the federal government has announced in the spring of 2021 that we wanted to reach -40 to -45 degrees in GNG emissions compared to our 2005 level. But between 2005 and 2019, we have decreased our GHG emissions by 1%, which means that in the 11 years between 2019 and 2030, we have to decrease it by another 39 to 44%, which is no small feat, to say the least. So we really do have to accelerate, no pun intended, Matt. We do have to accelerate, go a lot quicker than we are going right now regarding clean technology, renewable energy, electric mobility. We are not the leaders. Well, we are the leaders because the Canadian fleet of light-duty vehicles is the one who emits the most GHG emissions per kilometer driven. We are the leaders for that, but we want to be the leaders in the right way.
All right, our next question, we'll have Raj start with that one. What do you think governments can do to put Canada on the right road to a cleaner future and help support manufacturing in the adoption of clean technology?
Well, I think I touched on one example was encouraging domestic content in new initiatives like electric buses, electric trucks, etc. If a subsidy does exist, which is a tune that is being followed south of the border and elsewhere. I would also agree with some of the comments other speakers have made, with respect to, our pace of change here has been disappointing. So we really need all hands on deck on every sector, whether that be on the generation side. As Robert mentioned, we're at 80%, but that really should be going. There's no reason we can't be closing on 100% on electrification of the vehicles. There's no reason Canada can't follow Norway's model and do even better than that with domestic production of these technologies. And there's no real barrier for us to succeed and become a wealthier, more prosperous country if we do a good job on this. Now, if you don't take a leadership position and you take a follower position, we will end up being only being a raw material supplier to other countries who then provide us the goods to solve our problems. And that, in my mind, is not a good solution.
No, it's not. I just wanted to pick up a couple points that you're mentioning, Raj. I mean, it occurs to me in terms, there are precedents, right, in Canadian policy history around encouraging Canadian production, right? Think about the Canadian arts and culture industry, right? Bigger than forestry, by the way. That doesn't exist without Canadian content rules. So, whether it's on radio, whether it's on television, whether it's on in film. And so, it's pretty radical policy, but it's not without precedent, and it's led to a successful industry. But I think more broadly than that, look, Accelerate's 2 months old now, Daniel, I think that's about right. And so I'm new into this role. I'm struck by the lack of coordination across the federal and provincial and municipal governments on these kinds of files. Not everybody, but a lot of these governments want to position themselves as global leaders in electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles. Great. I mean, your heart's in the right place, but they don't seem to be talking with each other, and there doesn't seem to be any coordinated strategy. Now, part of our role is going to be helping that transition, but at the same time, again, something that's not without precedent in Canadian history is a lack of coordination across governments. And so, that's a huge opportunity for people to be working together, figuring out where the strengths are across the country, and figuring out how to fill gaps. And I think even if we were to move the dial 10% on that, we'd probably be much further ahead.
If I can, go ahead, Robert.
I was just going to say, I think I'd add that, what's going to drive investment in manufacturing is a market, fundamentally. And that's really where the key is. And I just will touch on something that Matthew said in terms of, because of our decentralized nature, that many of the provinces hold a lot of levers in these areas and that we're not coordinated. We have to recognize that Saskatchewan alone does not represent a market that's going to attract manufacturing. Even our bigger provinces, when you're sitting next to the United States, is not necessarily going to be on its own. And so the idea of having a more, not necessarily a nationally imposed approach, you can't have that, but more consistency, more collaboration, as was talked about, a more strategic approach as for the country as a whole is going to be critical. And I'll just use one quick example. We've all talked here already about, Canada has a commitment to move to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Fantastic, sends a very strong signal. The federal government has been very consistent in voicing that. We have provincial governments that have never mentioned net zero by 2050. And it's not clear that we are actually all on the same page or all working towards the same objective. And we need to build that consensus, because once we have a common objective, we have tremendous potential if we collaborate together to create economic opportunities in this country.
One thing I would like to mention is the fact that what worries me is that if we don't show leadership, we will end up losing jobs in Canada. For instance, in the automotive sector, if we don't show leadership in building a supply chain for electric vehicles from light to heavy duty, well, they might very well end up being made elsewhere. So Canadians will buy products, technologies, batteries, vehicles made either in Korea or China or Europe or in the US. So to me, that's a very important issue, because we want to fight climate change and create jobs, or do the job transition as well. And we all know, and I think that you have to be blind not to see this, that the oil and gas sector is going to go down as time passes by. So we want to make sure that we do help these workers transition from jobs in the fossil fuel industry to the renewable energy industry to the electric mobility industry. And that's something that's really important. Canadian government does, not only the federal, but provincial governments do as well. When Rajekar mentioned being inspired by Norway, I find it interesting that when we talk about being a global leader, because I've been hearing this a lot the past few years regarding electric mobility. If you look at the second quarter electric vehicle sales in Canada, we're at about 5%, 10% in Quebec, 13% in BC. In September of 2021, we're at 20% EV sales in China, which is the largest market in the world. So it means a lot of electric vehicles. 22% in France, 30% in Germany, and 91.5% in Norway. So by the spring of 2022, Norway will be at 100% EV sales. So for us at 5%, we're so far away from the leaders in the world that we need to go a lot quicker than we are right now. And what's happening south of the border is something of great interest and great preoccupation to our members, because we're looking at the Build Back Better plan from President Biden. What this could do is, in fact, really hurt the automotive industry in Canada and the EV industry in particular, meaning that since they want to give particular rebates for electric vehicles made by unions in the US, what that may mean is that potentially Canada will build the last gas vehicles in North America. And when that dies down, our industry will die down. Because right now, these announcements that have been made by Ford and GM and Stellantis, I am pretty sure that right now there are discussions in those offices saying, well, do we still want to keep building these vehicles in Canada if we get more of a rebate, because the same vehicle will be built in the US? I can tell you that one of our members, Unifor, is really thinking about this, and APMA as well, and Lion and Flow. So it's very important for us to see what's happening south of the border. We want to be leaders. We want to collaborate with the US, especially with what's happening in China, what's happening in Europe. But right now, there are issues at play which are preoccupying, to say the least, for our industry.
If I can I want to make a couple points, kind of echoing a couple of things that you said there. I mean, you mentioned the conventional oil and gas and energy transition. So we are a vendor into the conventional oil and gas business, and we make all kinds of pressure vessels and heat exchangers and piping systems for that industry and others. And what I think is really important is that from a government point of view, what can government do? It's provide us with some clarity and some kind of roadmap and some kind of certainty, because especially for small and mid-sized manufacturers like us, we look out at the market and say, where does our future lie? I happen to believe it's in clean tech, but there are lots of people who think, well, we're going to keep going with conventional oil and gas, and we'll wait till that industry comes back. And so some certainty, it requires coordination among the provinces, but some kind of long-term certainty and roadmap. Like if you look at Ontario as an example, we had a cap and trade system, and another government gets elected and that gets thrown in the garbage. So, now we have, carbon emission targets from this government. Maybe next year we have a different government and all that gets thrown in the garbage. So, some kind of as long-term, you can't really be long-term about these things, but some kind of consistent roadmap across the country and among the provinces that says, look, this is where we're going. So it makes sense to develop these technologies because this is where we're headed long-term. It makes sense to pivot your business to these emerging industries because this is where we're going long-term. So I think that kind of coordination or roadmap is really important. And I don't think we've really seen that. I think we see a lot of competing visions of the future. And it's unclear which one's going to win out. Long term, I think there's only one, but we may go through a lot of pain before we get there. The other thing I think is if we have that roadmap, I think we need champions. We need to champion our supply chain, like you guys have said. In Canada, we tend to be really shy about Canadian content and rules like that because we don't want to have conflict with our American neighbors or other trade partners. But no other countries are shy about it. I mean, every other country fosters their homegrown industry and has, the domestic content requirements. I think our governments should have some supply chain. They should definitely have preferential supply chain treatment for Canadian companies. And, I think they need to put in some policy requirements around that kind of thing. Even if we look at border adjustment on products coming in from countries that have, a poor record on environmental performance, maybe we need something like that. But I think our governments need to be a lot less shy and a lot more bold about, what they want to incentivize and what they want to grow and, put some teeth to these things. Otherwise, like you said, we're just going to be followers. We're not going to be leaders.
And if I just add, Robert, you'd said something really interesting earlier. I mean, the market's going to dictate this to a large degree, and a lot of the focus, maybe it's a Canadian thing, maybe it's not, is on what government can do, and it's really important, and we're working with government on that too. But look at where capital's going, right? Where's investment? It's in the short term, I get there are energy crises and oil goes up and all that kind of stuff, but the long-term trend is not that way. And investors want a more sustainable business model, and they know, particularly the big investors, the pension funds and the sovereign funds, and so they know where the puck is going. And I think we would be wise as a country to keep an eye on that puck and take advantage of those opportunities. And a part of that, of course, is government policy.
Yeah, I think one thing the Americans have is they have the Department of Energy. We have NRCan, which spans probably too many sectors. Some sort of, and to Dennis's point, governments change, and so you need a cohesive, some cohesive and long-term thinking, and that can't, in my mind, probably doesn't come from a democratically elected policymaker. It probably comes from a long-term goal driven by a bureaucracy that stays in place.
Well, I would add that beyond the market, we need regulation as well to make sure that we reach our targets, because it's one thing to set targets, quite another to reach them. Without regulation, I don't think we can make it. I mean, I remember back in 2005, when the federal government announced that they were signing a voluntary agreement with the OEMs to make sure that they lower their greenhouse gas emissions of the light-duty vehicle fleet by 5.2 megatons. Well, between 2005 and 2010, in fact, they lowered it by 0.26 megaton, which means that they missed the target by 95%. So to me, market is one thing, regulation is super important as well.
All right, our next question is going to be for Matthew. What makes Canada well suited to become a global zero-emission vehicle leader? How can building out a strong ZEV supply chain help Canada capitalize on the momentum generated by the global push to net zero?
So we've talked about a lot of this already in this meeting. I think it's important for people, but I say people, I mean governments. I also mean regular Canadians, to understand that we actually have most of the components of a successful electric vehicle and zero emission vehicle industry, right? So everything from getting the stuff out of the ground to refining it to building, look at the work that Raj is doing, to building, the critical components of electric vehicles or even zero emission vehicles writ large. And we've got really strong R&D researchers in this country. We've got universities that are focused on this. We've got associations that are committed to building out a strong industry. What we don't have is that coordinated approach, which is the work that we're doing. So we are really well positioned relative to pretty much every other jurisdiction in the world to be a competitive player across the industry. I mean, a lot of other jurisdictions, the EU, Australia, have come up with sort of battery strategies, really important, really well thought out processes, but it's the batteries, right? So we've got that. We've got the drivetrain components, we've got assembly, we've got other manufacturers, and we have, as I sort of say, the natural, the built, and the human resources to be really competitive in this space. So, the future is bright. We've identified some of the real challenges, and obviously immediate challenges with what's going on in the US. But if we are able to coordinate this and integrate the supply chain, we can actually be a really effective player globally.
I'll jump in on that as well. I think our resource base, right, like our mining sector, I think is a huge opportunity to build on for that industry. I think our strength in obviously the automotive chain, as Matthew has said, and just metalworking generally. Southern Ontario is globally one of the centers of metalworking and machinery building. So I think those are big strengths. And then I think our strength in in energy, right? Like nuclear, hydrogen. I think we are going to be, as the hydrogen ecosystem kind of emerges, I think we have an opportunity to be big players in that. We already have some great experience in hydrogen fuel cells in this country. So I think we can build on that. We have a lot of that clean energy. And that allows us to invest in new technologies around energy storage, whether that's batteries or hydrogen or other forms of energy storage. We're well positioned because we have a lot of excess off-peak energy that we can that we can use to develop those technologies. So I think we're well positioned for it.
Yeah, it's pretty much agree with what Matthew and Dennis said. We have all the pieces. It's just a matter of coming with a cohesive direction to put them together. We have all the right ingredients to make this success. It's just need a little bit of leadership.
Yeah, and I just very briefly pick up maybe a little bit on what Dennis said, because you mentioned critical minerals, super important. But it was said earlier in this conversation in another context that we don't want to be the hewers of wood and drawers of water anymore, right? We don't need to be, and so we can absolutely mine this stuff, but we can also bring higher and higher value up the chain, and that's really where our focus should be. And Raj, you're absolutely right. I mean, we need that direction, we need that framework, and we need leadership across industry, from government and from investors too, right? And if we can do that, we can be more than just the miners, right? We can have a footprint across the supply chain, whether it's building the final vehicle or not, which we do, obviously, through some of our light and heavy duty, medium and heavy duty vehicles, but we can be doing more and more of that in the future.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, and we've got lots of experience with this. Danielle mentioned this earlier. I mean, targets are not enough. You need strategies. And right now, I think we have a lot of one-off measures, which are all good measures in and of themselves, but because they're not actually coordinated within a strategy, are less effective than they could otherwise be. And, that strategy needs to include elements related to regulation, as Danielle said, market signals, and infrastructure. There's all sorts of elements that have to go into that strategy, and I think you've got an industry that's really ready to roll if that's in place and is ready to respond. But right now it's still too many one-off signals.
All right, moving on to our next question. This one will be for Robert. What are the main barriers to the development of renewable energy sources? In turn, what actions should be taken to remove or replace these barriers to the chances of developing renewable energy sources?
Sure. So I'll start maybe just by saying CanRIA released a vision document just a couple of weeks ago, where we looked at what is the likely contribution of wind, solar, and energy storage to our pathway to net zero. There's a broad consensus. We have to clean up the electricity system, decarbonize it. We have to expand it to support electrification across industry, transport, and buildings. But what does that mean in real terms? And we looked at a whole range of studies that have been done on net zero and concluded that, a pretty reasonable scenario is you need to increase wind and solar production tenfold in the next 30 years. And that means you have to build this out at a rate that's 8 times faster than the rate we've averaged over the last 5 years. So this gives you a sense of that need to accelerate the urgency that's required for this. It's not just urgency to meet the emission reduction objective, it's urgency to compete for the investment that's going to be required to meet that emission reduction objective. So what do you need to do in the Canadian context for that? The first thing is we do need in the electricity sector market and regulatory reform to enable energy storage to play a much larger role, as Dennis just mentioned. Right now, our electricity regulatory frameworks don't actually provide a mechanism to allow energy storage to come into the grid or to provide services to the grid in many provinces. Until that happens, it's just a great technology that nobody can use. Same thing for distributed energy resources. So we need market and regulatory reform. We're going to need new investment in infrastructure like transmission, which is always challenging to do. But more importantly, we need to think about how to use our existing transmission more efficiently. And we need to look at how we can use tools like storage and distributed energy resources to serve as alternatives that can actually help us to defer or sometimes even avoid new transmission investment going forward, because transmission is expensive, takes a long time to do, and all that sort of stuff. But in many ways, the most important thing that has to happen is we need to create demand. And nobody's going to invest in new electricity supply unless they think there's going to be demand for that electricity going forward. And that's why we need comprehensive strategies around green hydrogen or hydrogen in general, comprehensive strategies around electrification, because that's what will stimulate the investment in the supply that can actually enable those solutions to be implemented and put forward. And I think that at the end of the day, one of the neat things about this panel is the diversity of people who are sitting on it, because I think that at the end of the day, the only way we're going to move forward is if we get out of the sort of silos of thinking, well, we're electricity supply and we've got our issues and this is what we got to do, and we're electricity users. We have to work together to bring forward solutions, the supply and the demand, because we're both ultimately involved in designing and delivering those solutions. And I think, Danielle's mentioned we're doing work with Electric Mobility Canada. There's more of this collaboration going on, and it's going to be absolutely critical to enabling both the new supply to be built and the new demand to be there to take advantage of that.
I could expand on that. I had an interesting conversation last year with a scientist from the US who said that if Alexander Graham Bell came back to life today and he saw a smartphone, he would be really impressed. He said that if Edison came back to life today and saw the electricity grid today, he said, well, not much has changed. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that we evolve quickly regarding the grid and the distribution system, whether it's for electric mobility, renewable energy. And when we're looking at the US and what happened in Texas last winter, it's a perfect example of an antiquated way of thinking things. We have to work more collaboratively, not just amongst ourselves, but I mean, it's interesting to see these days that there's some infighting between Ontario, Quebec, and Atlantic Canada regarding electricity distribution, while we could be helping one another. And we're looking at the US. Let's say we'll sell it to the US. We're counting on the US, but the US more and more they're saying no, we'll build our own supply of electricity, of renewable energy, and not to mention the fact that there are some fights, and there was a referendum about a month and a half ago south of the border for people for Hydro-Québec not to pass its transmission line, through Maine. So when we're looking at this, it's are we missing a great opportunity to work collaboratively between provinces so that we can develop a cleaner grid and a more efficient grid? So that was my 2 cents from the electricity generation point of view. But to me, this is very intertwined, interconnected with electric mobility, because we have to collaborate as well for electric mobility. Right now, what we're looking in Quebec, what we're doing in Quebec and what Ontario is doing or not doing, the Ford government is starting to see that there's an interest there for the development of an electric mobility industry, but they're way behind the curve. I mean, Ontario should be the leader, and it's not right now when we're talking about renewable energy, electric mobility. So more coordination is key. And I don't know about you, Robert, but for the past 2.5 months now, we've been discussing with the Ontario government about, electric mobility development in Ontario, and they're starting to see that they're missing the boat. So I think that there's more and more clarity on the fact that we need to accelerate, we need to move faster, we need to try and work together. And we launched our 2030 V Action Plan about a month ago, so that we can accelerate electric mobility from light to heavy duty, from mining to mobility and all that. But honestly, in 2022, one of the very important targets for Electric Mobility Canada is going to be to basically write a Canadian electric mobility strategy for the country. But we want to do this in a collaborative way, meaning we're going to sit at the same table. We will invite at our table people from CanRIA, people from Accelerate, people from the federal government and the provincial governments as well, so that we can come up with a comprehensive strategy. That really is one of our goals for 2022 at EMC.
Yeah, I might just to jump in to build on something that Danielle said quickly in terms of the importance, first off, of collaboration. In Canada, we have a long history of saying we have 10 provincial electricity grids. We work to optimize each of those grids, and the only thing we know for sure that results from that is that nationally we have a suboptimal grid. Yeah. Because we've avoided looking at all the opportunities for collaboration and cooperation going forward. So, and I guess the other thing I would point out is that when I talked about the regulatory and market reform, we've got a whole range of disruptive technologies entering the electricity industry. It's much like what we saw in telecommunications and everything else. And we've got an electricity system that was built for the electricity grid of 20 years ago. And we have to make it a priority to build the electricity grid that we need for the future going forward. And I think, to build on what Danielle said, I think there's a lot of reason for optimism that message is coming through and that work is beginning, but we are behind and we've got to accelerate.
I'd also like to build on what a few of you have said about the problem being also on the demand side. I think that Canada is made up of a lot of small and mid-sized businesses, and we as a country and as small businesses, I guess we have a reputation of being a little bit risk averse, and not necessarily being on the cutting edge of new technologies. So I think there's work that needs to be done there to de-risk some of these investments for residential applications and for small business applications. I think a lot of us look at electrifying forklifts in our warehouses, and we say, I don't know. I don't know enough about that. I don't know if that's the right technology. I think that technology is going to get better in the next few years. Maybe we'll wait and we'll see where that goes. Same with solar panels or electric cars. And a lot of people will say, well, let's see how this plays out. And I think that some work could be done to de-risk some of those investments, and whether that's, I don't know, subsidies or tax credits or something, so that companies and individuals say, look, if I buy this, if I make this investment, if I transfer over to this clean technology, it might cost me more. It's a bit of a risk, but it'll pay off. And I think we have to build that demand side too, as you guys have said. So I think there's that risk averse nature is a barrier.
And we mentioned buy Canadian policies, but there's also the buy green policies that we could push, because if we look at the international trade agreements, when we're talking about buy American or made in America or buy Canadian or made in or made in Canada, it might be controversial from an international agreement point of view, but buy green,
Yeah.
has no problem, and that we could absolutely should put in our RFPs, and that's something that's accepted in international trade agreements, and I can't believe we haven't done it yet.
It's so easy to do as well. I mean, on steel, for instance, Chinese steel is produced with coal in large quantities, and both on the electricity side and on the processing side. If you incentivize clean steel, the Canadian industry would probably flourish. Same thing on batteries. That's my sector. The way batteries are manufactured. We have a technology that removes solvents and is thus much more environmentally friendly. Up until now, there hasn't been a strong push to go that direction because people are quite happy to have that solvent emissions in Asia. But if you put regulations on that, you would probably support more domestic innovation, and it's also better for the planet.
One of the things that I think of it too is a lot of the conversation we're having is around investment. It's around building up demand, for example. There's a PR job to do as well, right, with Canadians. And I think a lot of the conversations around clean technologies, gets caught up in the climate change discussion and net zero, and it's overwhelming to a lot of people. And there's a kind of a legacy of, oh, that's the green left that's talking, right? And it's not a conversation about jobs and investment. And I think maybe that is slowly changing, but the more this conversation centers on Canada's economic future, the better off we all are. And it's not that we don't talk about the climate; it's super important, but that's, it's overwhelming to most people.
Okay, we're going to go to our second round of questions. So this one will be for Daniel. The rise of electric vehicle adoption in Canada has the potential to tax the electricity production supply. An increase in the total number of electricity produced will have to increase substantially. How do we ensure we're producing power cleanly and efficiently?
Well, by working with Robert. No, but seriously, seriously, people have this tendency to think that if we get more and more electric vehicles on the road, it's going to be a super hard issue to deal with, because all the electric vehicles will be plugged in at the same time. And I mean, already it's not that much of an issue. Let's start with the basic facts. Most people charge their vehicles at night when there's less demand for electricity. So what that means is that when there's peak demand, whether it's in the morning or at night, we can put together systems, which are being put together right now, actually, to make sure that the vehicles start charging at 10 at night, for instance, so that during the night when there's less demand, it's not so much an issue. Plus, we have to think about vehicle to grid, vehicle to home, and bidirectional charging, which is going to be also part of the electric grid for smarter energy management, smarter electricity management. And that's not coming out, that's not going to be ready between now and the next 5 years, but that's further ahead, but that's going to be part of the plan. So we do have to make sure that our grid providers, our utilities adapt to these new realities. But in fact, these discussions have started right now at EMC, as they have at Canada, I'm sure, because we're looking at this. And don't forget that I had this interesting conversation with someone from the Ontario government about a month and a half ago, and they were talking to me about the fact that, well, grid adaptation or grid improvement or updates would cost quite a bit of money. And I said to people from the Ontario government, I said, well, how much is it costing you right now to import oil? Because Ontario is not an oil producer, to import oil on a monthly basis for transportation. And I was stunned to realize that that person did not have that number. So I made the calculation and it comes up to $1.2 billion a month. So if we save that much money not importing oil for transportation just in the province of Ontario, there's a lot of money there that can be invested in cleaner grids, not to mention the fact that this money will stay in Ontario instead of, going away in other provinces or going outside to the US. Because right now, a lot of the oil that comes to Canada is not Canadian oil, it's US oil that we are buying from the United States. So yes, it's going to cost money. It's going to take some adaptation, but there's a lot of savings that can be made. And last but not least, let's talk about health for just a second. If you look at the Health Canada report from 2021, what they're talking about is they estimate that the economic cost of air pollution on Canadian citizens is $120 billion a year. And most of that pollution comes from transportation and oil and gas. So if we take that out of the equation, there's a lot of money to save. So billions of dollars that can be saved and thousands of lives that can be saved as well.
Daniel, I like your comparison with the oil and gas industry. I hear this argument all the time that we can't solve the problem with electric vehicles because there's not enough electricity, and to electrify all these vehicles. And it reminds me of during the 90s we were talking about how we had reached peak oil and how there wasn't going to be enough oil in the world to power all of our vehicles. And what happened in that industry, right? They found all kinds of money to invest in finding more oil, right? So I'm not worried that we're not going to be able to invest in additional electricity generation, right? Or making our grid more efficient and smarter, as you've said. So it always strikes me as an odd argument to make. Well, we shouldn't pursue electric vehicles because there won't be enough electricity. It's a bit silly. So I think there will be enough electricity. There can be enough electricity, and there's a lot of technologies that have to emerge. We're looking at some projects in small modular reactors, in the nuclear industry. That could be a potential way to bring cleaner energy, to areas that don't have hydroelectricity, for example. So I think there's a technology that will emerge if we decide we want to invest our resources in exploring those opportunities. So yeah, I'm not worried about running out of electricity.
Yeah, I mean, it remains important to move as quickly as we can to decarbonize the grid. The federal government has indicated that it wants to move forward with a clean electricity standard that would produce a net zero electricity grid by 2035. I think that's very important to move forward with. And Canada's in a very strong position to do that, not just because 80% of electricity is already non-emitting, but because we have numerous options actually to provide additional non-emitting electricity, right? It's not, we believe wind and solar are going to play a pretty central role because of the lowest cost sources of electricity generation available today. But, small modular reactors are being considered. There's opportunities for new hydro development. There are a range of opportunities available. And really what we need to be doing is when we look, it's a significant investment that we're talking about, but it is an investment. I wouldn't call it a cost, it's an investment. Yeah. A significant investment that we need to do. And it's in our interest to ensure that we're actually designing our market and regulatory frameworks to ensure that we're able to consider all the options, because we want to make the smartest choices. We want to find the lowest cost pathway going forward. And I expect the solution is going to involve a mix of different technologies, right, going forward. But again, there's that element of urgency. There's that element of needing to accelerate how we're looking at these questions to be able to go forward. Electricity is a sector, I mean, I guess not like the others we're talking about here, but electricity is a sector where you have long planning times. Yep. You build new generation facilities and you want them to run for 25 to 40 years, right? So every day you're taking a decision which is locking you down a pathway. And so it's important to get the signals in place now so that the decisions we're taking today are consistent with the pathway that we actually want to follow.
I would like to add something very important, because very often when we talk about electric vehicles being part of the solution, I think that we also have to consider, when we're talking about mobility, the fact that I'll give you an example. Every morning on a weekday, people in Quebec drive cars. Okay, there's 25 million empty seats being driven around in Quebec right now on during rush hour, meaning that there's an average of 1.1 to 1.2 person per vehicle in their light duty vehicle. So yes, I agree that technology is key and very important, an important part of the solution, but just making sure that the governments, whether it's at the municipal, provincial, or federal level, understand that if we just go from a bunch of gas vehicles to a bunch of electric vehicles and everybody's by themselves in this big vehicle, it's not very efficient. So we have to come up with solutions and policies that will support carpooling and car sharing, because otherwise it's just a waste of a big vehicle being driven around most of the time half empty or 3/4 empty. That also has to be part of the equation, because it's not enough to talk about technology. We have to make sure that people have more responsible behaviors through good policies, whether it's for electricity consumption, because we are big consumers of electricity, big consumer of oil and gas, big consumer of gasoline. So that's something we have to look into as well.
All right, going on to the next question. This one will be for Robert. What do Canadian companies have to do to become more carbon neutral? Do you feel complete carbon neutrality is an achievable goal?
So to answer the last part of the question, yes. In the first part of the question, I mean, I think there are, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, I think electricity is a big part of the story, but it's not the whole story. So everybody uses electricity, so you can be decarbonizing by ensuring you're using decarbonized electricity. There are many potential applications of energy use today where electrification does present a real alternative, right? And that will provide an opportunity for using that decarbonized electricity to do that. But again, it's not the whole story. We have had discussions already in this conversation around hydrogen. There are going to be discussions around different forms of biofuels. There are a range of technologies that are at the fore. I often would argue that, when we're looking at a country or a company moving towards carbon neutrality, that the biggest part of the challenge, there are technological issues out there, or technology issues still out there, but I would argue that the biggest challenge is fundamentally not technology issues. The biggest challenge is sort of market signals, regulatory frameworks that enable us to either be incented or to have access to these technologies that can help us to achieve these decarbonization objectives. So we do need research and development to continue with respect to technology, but we are massively underutilizing the technologies we already know are proven and well aware of.
I might add that a big companies, that's a pretty broad spectrum, right? So if you're talking about manufacturers, it's different than if you're talking to a bank, right? But I will say that companies often get caught up in conversations, say around, okay, how do we measure our emissions, and what sustainability framework should we use, et cetera, et cetera. When the best companies are asking themselves through their strategic planning processes, what does the world want, right? And can we make it for them? Can we make money and be a profitable concern by being carbon neutral? And let's figure out that process. And I think that having honest internal conversations around what your company can be in the future, in a changed future, is really important. It's kind of, these are kind of first principles, but I'm shocked, and I've had lots and lots of conversations with directors on big company boards, for example, who don't have these conversations. But some of the really good ones, and you'd all know the companies do have these conversations. What's our company going to look like in 15 years? What are we actually going to be doing? What are we going to be making? What are we selling? Because it's not the stuff that we're selling now, because there's not going to be a market for that. So I think what companies can do is have honest internal conversations about what their companies should be doing to be profitable in the future.
All right, moving on to the next question. This one will be for Dennis. What are some of the obstacles, general or technical, that Canada faces in our path to go green, and how can these be overcome?
Again, I guess it touches on something that we've discussed before. I think the obstacle is not really technical. I think the obstacle is more kind of organizational, right? Like, we have all of the pieces, and we have the resources, we have the knowledge. What we don't have is the coordination, right? We don't have a road plan. We don't have a kind of a coordinated approach across provinces and federally. We don't have a coordinated approach between the public sector and the private sector. It's like all of these kind of things are happening in isolation. Just as an example, we're participating in the kind of emerging hydrogen ecosystem. And, there's conferences across the country, and everybody's talking about hydrogen and what's this going to look like? We don't know. What's it going to look like in Ontario? What's it going to look like in Alberta? What technologies are we going to back and get behind? What are we most well suited to? And it's a lot of uncoordinated activity going on across the country and in different public, private sectors, universities. And there's just not a lot of coordination. So I think that's our biggest obstacle, is just a lack of that kind of coordinated roadmap. And I think we have all the pieces of the puzzle, but there's nobody with all the pieces on the table trying to put them together into one picture.
I would add education and training as well, because the technologies are there. When we're talking about electric mobility, I've been having conversations with people from the private sector for years, if not decades, and many of them don't know what's in it for them, what are the issues, what are the opportunities, what are the technologies. So I would say that on a monthly basis for many, many years, I've been talking to different companies or institutions saying, well, this is what you can do. Can we do this? I'll be honest with you. It's even worse than that. I am teaching some OEMs how electric mobility works, believe it or not. So there's so much education that needs to be done, to help transition towards electric vehicles from light to heavy duty. So education is very important. And the other one, training. I'm sure you see the same thing, Robert, in your segment. But what we see is that we need qualified workers. We need interested workers and passionate workers to start working in our industry. And right now we are still in COVID, and we are looking to find workers, and it's not an easy task. So I'm just trying to imagine what it's going to be after COVID, when things really pick up. It's going to be an issue to find qualified people. So we have to have plans to make sure that we train as many people as we can, or retrain as many people as we can, so they can fill these positions, because otherwise we won't be able to grow as fast.
I'd like to just add one more thing that Daniel kind of triggered a thought for me when you talk about training. I was thinking about it a little bit differently, and it's kind of training of the workforce. So, one of the barriers that I think we have in this country is that we have a long-standing existing investment in conventional energy, right? So, we have a vested interest as a nation in the oil and gas industry. There's a lot of jobs there. There's a lot of money there. The economies of entire provinces rely on that industry, and it is a barrier to going green, right? Because we have to say, we're not going to pursue those industries anymore. We're going to pursue these other industries. Well, what happens to all of the people that derive their livelihoods from the oil and gas sector? It's easy to say academically, we're going to go through an energy transition and, these are the technologies of the future, but we're talking about, real people and real families who live in real places. And, I sell to those companies. A lot of them are my customers. And, how do we get, we have to get them on board. There has to be something in it for them. And they have to be part of the transition. It can't be a transition that leaves them behind, and that happens in spite of them. It has to happen with them. And a lot of those people working in the energy industry have the skills that we need if in this energy transition. We talk about hydrogen. I mean, the same people that are working on equipment for oil and gas are going to be the ones working on equipment for hydrogen. And so I think that is a barrier too, is we've not got the buy-in of the people engaged in the kind of conventional industries where we have this kind of fixed investment, and you can't walk away from that fixed investment and those people and pursue some other transition without them. So I think that's important to get them on board. And maybe that's through some kind of training, grants, incentives, making them economically benefit from a transition.
But you see, Dennis, what you just mentioned, because I've been talking about this to people at the federal level for quite a while now. There are new programs now in place to help workers transition to greener technology. So, but you have to know about these programs, and you have to get teachers to give these training programs and retraining programs. So that's very important. But because you're absolutely right, and we can't leave these people behind. I mean, I remember back in 10 years ago, in 2011, there was the issue of a refinery that would shut down, that would close actually in Montreal. And I went to the Quebec government, and I went to the union, and I went to the company. I said, well, why don't we use these infrastructure and transform them into a biomethane plant, And all of them said, no, we just want to keep this place open. So it closed. And 10 years later, we're still looking for a place to install a biomethane plant in Montreal. So we missed a great opportunity there. I couldn't believe that the union would, be on board with this. But to them, there was a conservative way of thinking at things. Say, no, let's keep doing what we've been doing for years, if not decades, and I hope that it's going to stay that way. To me, I look at this and I say, well, haven't you heard about Blockbuster or other technologies that have disappeared? Because it's happening, and it's happening really quickly, like Robert said. So we have to be on top of this game, and right now we're not.
All right, our next question will be for Raj. What are the most crucial areas or burning issues in energy-based research today?
Oh, there's a lot of the amount of research happening in energy is probably going up exponentially. I try to stay abreast on some of the battery research, and the number of papers being published is increasing. It's always been large, but it's increasing year by year. So the big push in the battery space is research with regards to solid state batteries, which would be enabling much higher energy densities, potentially enable electric aircrafts, lower cost of electric vehicles, etc. So it's a big area of research taking place. We ourselves are heavily involved in that. So my team of 6 PhDs are very focused on that. Then in other sectors, of course, other speakers here mentioned hydrogen. There's plenty of research going on there. I as a scientist, I believe nuclear is a technology we shouldn't ignore. France has 70% of their electricity derived from nuclear energy. It's a non-emitting technology, and if done, and Canada actually has some very valuable technology there that which hasn't been exploited or built on in many years. So I'd say that there's many, that's just a few of them. Of course, there's research in solar, wind, etc. But I think all these areas need to be promoted. No one area needs to, should be the key focus. Yeah, that would be my opinion.
All right, as I know that we're coming to the end of our time, I'm going to give the last question to Matthew. How will building out Canada's ZEV supply chain help to ensure Canadian metals and minerals mining supports the domestic production of electric vehicles?
Well, listen, I think we've talked a lot about that already, particularly at the beginning of this conversation. It's a couple of things. One, it provides a little bit more visibility and certainty to the industry that there are more downstream users of their product, right? And so if you can create, or you're not creating a market, but if you can help foster a market for that, then it encourages production. And I think too, and it's something that was talked about before, I mean, a lot of what we actually produce in the mining sector in the battery space is sent overseas into different markets, right? And so, and then we buy these things back at a premium, and they're built and great, fantastic, but you're not really creating a lot more economic opportunity for the country. So, I think if we can create a viable and integrated supply chain, it allows that product to stay domestic, and it kind of reshores the industry to some degree. I mean, this is only a segment of that industry, of course, but it does create a market for their product that is domestic. And then, of course, it's an integrated market with the United States and North America more generally. But it allows some predictability and access to a market in Canada. So.
All right, and with that, oh, sorry.
I just wanted to mention that back in February of 2021, President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau signed an agreement. It was called a Roadmap for Renewed U.S.-Canada Partnership, where they said that they would agree to work together to build the necessary supply chains to make Canada and the United States global leaders in all aspects of battery development and production. And to that end, the leaders agreed to strengthen the Canada-U.S. Critical Minerals Action Plan to target a net zero industrial transformation, batteries for zero-emission vehicles, and renewable energy storage. And to me, this is very important. So that's why I'm a bit puzzled by the fact that the U.S. administration is coming up with this Build Back Better plan, which kind of contradicts this agreement that Canada and the U.S. signed a few months ago. But we think that, working collaboratively with the U.S., if we can find a way, would be the best way forward for all of our industries.
All right, and with that brings us to the end of our conversation. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for the lively discussion about CleanTech. Plant Magazine would like to thank all the panelists and our roundtable sponsor, Alps Welding. Thank you again.